Hello everyone and welcome back. This is episode 2 of my Python course where I'll be explaining everything that you need to know to get started programming in Python. Now in the last video we covered how to install Sublime Text, which was the text editor I recommend that you guys install if you're planning to follow along with me on this course. And then I also showed you guys how you can write a very quick Python program which should just print out hello world in the console output. Now in this video, I'll be elaborating on some of those ideas that I introduced in the last video and explaining some new things which should help strengthen your understanding of how programming works. Now, in the last video, I used this word called print to print out hello world. Now what that is actually part of is something called the print function, and I'll explain that in just a minute. We're then going to talk about data types and how many different types of data types there are, and how we can differentiate them from each other and how we can use them. Finally, we're going to talk about something else, which is dynamically typed versus statically typed languages. And this is less of a technical topic, but more of a concept to wrap your minds over. So, you probably will see a bunch of Python courses online. If you just search up YouTube Python course, it should just show you a bunch of tutorials, 11-hour courses maybe, however long they may be. But they don't really cover some of the basic concepts behind programming. And they mainly just go into just deep diving into the practical stuff. But if you don't really understand the concept behind it, so things like dynamically typed versus statically typed languages and object-oriented programming in depth, then you won't really understand how to go around fixing a problem or coding a project out whenever you actually start making real world projects. And because of that, I'm going to be teaching you a few more of the concepts behind programming as we do some of the practical stuff, so you guys have some of the base understandings that you need to get started making real world projects as well. Okay, so since we talked about all of that, we can go on to the first part of this video, which is talking about this line of code I wrote in the last video. Now, I'm gonna break this down for you guys so you can understand it in chunks and make sure that you really can wrap your head around this. So first off, what does print mean? It's pretty intuitive, but print will just show us will print something out in the console output. And so in this case, this line of code will just print out hello world because we told it to print out this thing here, which you call a string. I'll explain that in just a minute, which is saying hello world. So we can print out lots of things. It's not just printing out things like hello world. And the reason I put these quotation marks inside of it is because this is something called a string, which is which is a data type. And as I said, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So the syntax for using this print is going to be print, and then we're going to add an open brackets and close brackets. So whenever you see something like a word or a small line of code and you got this at the end of it, understand that is either calling a function or you are going to be defining a function. So, to elaborate on this a bit more, when we said print, open brackets, close brackets, we're saying to Python, okay, there's this thing called print that you have inside the language, and that's something called a function, which we'll talk about later, and we want to use this print function to print out some text like hello world. And this is not just to text. If you want to print out a number, we are going to just do something like print open brackets 8. Let's just say that's a number. If we want to print out a decimal value, we can do print 8.8 like that. And we can basically do whatever we want. So what print just does is that it prints something out onto the screen. That's the simplest way you can put it. Now, the reason it might be a bit confusing when I was explaining it, because I used words like strings, and these two values here have specific names as well, And in programming, the reason I use these terms is because this is what we're going to be talking about now, which is data types. And data types is the absolute basics of programming. Let's just rub this entire thing out to get a clean screen here. Okay. Here we go. Now, you may be asking me, well, what's a string? What's a integer? What's a float? What all these words means? What do all of these words mean? And they're all just data types. So I'll just write down here as a header, data types. Okay. And I think the best way you can understand this is going to be through a visual example. So let's just say I have a piece of data right here, and it's just a word let's just say it's a number, which is 8. Now, there's 4 different categories we can put this piece of data into, and those categories are called data types. So I'll just draw a few boxes here to make this a bit easier to understand. Okay, so I got all the boxes arranged, and now I'm gonna give these 4 boxes different names. So here in this box, we're gonna call anything that goes into an integer. Then let's do the same color. We'll do floats. Then we'll do booleans, and then we'll finally do strings. Okay, so this piece of data, which is a number called 8, can go into one of 4 categories. It can either become an integer, it can either be classified as an integer, a float, a boolean, or a string. Now, what do I mean by classified? Well, any piece of data that we have, so data is simply anything which a data is just a piece of information, and so to understand this better, we can think this data as a piece of information, and this piece of information by default is one of these 4 types. So let's just say if you have any piece of information, it has to be one of these 4 types for it to be classified as a piece of information. I hope that made sense. So what integers are, it's a data type, and it's just simply whole numbers. Let's write that down. Whole numbers. So a whole number like 8, 2. Yeah. So you probably would have guessed that this right here is an integer. I should have put this box here last, but well. So 8 is going to be this. 8 is going to be an integer. Now floats are decimal numbers. And when I showed you an example before, I said something like, I believe it was 8.8. So anything which has a dot and then some numbers after it will basically be a decimal number. So any decimal number, it's a float. It's a float value. Then we have booleans, and booleans, I got a bit confused on this when I first started out. But what booleans are is just simply 2 things. So true or false. So true or false. So that might not make much sense right now, but what a boolean helps us do is that whenever we're doing anything in programming, we can simplify it down into 2 values, which is true or false. So let's just say we have a string. Actually, no, I didn't actually talk about strings yet. I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's just say we got an integer, which is 8. So let's just say we have a program which will check that if 8 is equal to 8. So what this is basically doing is 8 equal to 8? Well, yes, because 8 is equal to 8. And that means that this statement here, it's true. Okay, so let's just say something else like, is 8 equal to 9? Well, 8 is not equal to 9 because 8 is 8. And in that case, this will be wrong. It will be false. So it's a basic example, but it shows you how booleans, so whatever program we have, so whatever instructions are given to the computer, we can simplify it down into two values, true or false. And that's one of the basic concepts of programming as well. Okay, let's just rub all this stuff out. Finally, we can talk about strings, and what strings are is, well, the technical definition is anything inside of double quotations or single quotations, it doesn't matter. But usually strings are just a pile of words. So we have a bunch of words or text, we're going to put it in double brackets or double quotations or single quotations. It doesn't really matter. Whatever's inside of this, it's classified as a string. And so when we printed out hello world over here, this hello world is a string. And for a print right here, it's what we call a built-in function. We're going to talk that a bit more in a later video, because that's kind of going to some more advanced concepts like object-oriented programming and learning a bit more about functions. Now, finally, before we get into the coding part and actually showing you how we can integrate all of this with the stuff that we learned in the last video, which is how we can use print, I'm just gonna quickly talk to you guys about the thing that I said at the start of the video, which is about this thing called dynamically typed versus statically typed languages. Well, I think the best way to put this is going to be that over here we have these four integers. We have these four values, so data types. Now, if I just use this line of code here, I can do things like print 8, which will print out 8. Now, there are actually abbreviations that we use in programming. So let's just say we have an integer. So 8 would actually be int 8. And 8.8 will be called float 8. And hello, in single quotations in this example, it can also be double quotations, will be called str, which stands for string. String. Oops, I should probably just rub that out. Okay, string hello. And booleans like true will be equal to bool, which means boolean, then true. So this may not make much sense right now, but once we go into the programming part, this idea, when you guys keep on thinking about it, then it will slowly sink in, then it'll make a lot of sense. But whenever we run our program, so what happens is, whenever we run our program, there's two ways that can happen. So we have got a compiler, and then we've got a runtime. Now, I really do not want to talk about these concepts right now, so I'm going to give you a really basic example, which might not be the full story of it, but it's just to make sure you guys aren't confused. So, what Python has, let's use an example of another language. Let's say C++. If you guys don't know what C++ is, it's a language, just give it a quick Google, you'll figure out what it is. But C++ is what we call a statically typed language. And Python, on the other hand, the one we're learning right now, let's use blue, because Python's logo is in dark blue, but I've only got a light blue here. Python is what we call a dynamically typed language, and C++ is what we call a statically typed language. Now, why does this matter, and what's the difference between them? Now, a dynamically typed language like Python, you'll see in the practical demonstration we're going to do in just a few minutes. As I print 8, I do have to define right here 8 to be something like here. So int 8. So I don't have to do something. So I don't have to do this. So print integer 8. And this is because whenever we oh, by the way, int is also another built-in function because using parentheses. Let's use a different color to highlight that. So using parentheses, so that means it's a built-in function. We're talking about built-in functions just in a later video. But I want to make you guys know the keywords so you understand whenever you see another tutorial about Python. Now, So let's go back to what we're talking about. I did not have to define that this eighth piece of data right here is actually an integer, and that's because whenever you run the program, Python has something called an interpreter, which goes through the entire program line by line and checks all the values and then make sure that it knows that, okay, this is an integer, this is a string, this is a float, this is a boolean, whatever it is. So go through and check whatever piece of data is, because whenever you run the program, it's going to send all these instructions to the CPU. Let's just draw a diagram of the CPU here. Let's just do a quick drawing of it. And the CPU needs to know, okay, this piece of data, this thing that you're telling me to do, what pieces of data is involved? What types of data are these pieces of data? You're telling me to print out a string. Okay, now is this, so let's just say we're telling to print out a bunch of words. It's gonna be asking the Python, okay, is this a string? Is this a integer? What is it? So the CPU, Python sends the instructions to run the program. It needs to know what type of data a piece of data is. Now, statically typed languages on the other, statically typed languages on the other hand, they do not. They've got something called a compiler, which simply, they kind of have things a bit rough, since they have to manually, you have to define each and every piece of data that you use. So let's just say I've got an integer called 8. I have to, in C++, this would be kind of the syntax. I have to make sure that the computer knows that 8 is an integer. Python does that for us whenever we run the program. The interpreter goes ahead and checks every line of code and then makes sure that it knows what piece of data each data is, so it can tell the CPU. However, C++, it just, whenever we run it, it's just going to go through and check if each piece of data is the right type, because it's just going to just make sure that you're giving it the right information, so that we don't get a crash whenever we get a CPU, and it's going to give us an error if we didn't do it properly. So that's the thing. So another thing about statically typed versus dynamically typed languages is that dynamically typed languages are often a lot slower than statically typed languages. So Python, as an example, it's very slow compared to C++, like extremely slow, since the interpreter has to manually check everything. C++, the compiler's got it very easy. It just has to go through each line of code, make sure that you define what it is, and if you did it, just throws an error. And for that reason, whenever we're doing something like, so for something which we need to last for years without having to change the code, we're probably going to be using a statically typed language, because C++ is more reliable and is less likely to crash once we wrote down the code. Python, on the other hand, takes a lot longer to run and is not as reliable often, because it's not common at all, but it's less reliable than C++ whenever using it long term. So I know I went on quite a long time for that. So we're gonna go into a bit of a practical part of the video. We're gonna be showing you how you can implement all of these ideas, and then hopefully you'll be able to experiment with this. And I recommend that you watch other people's videos on this before you watch the next video in the series, and then you will have a bit more of an understanding before you just jump in, so it won't be something completely new. I'd recommend that you play around with this and see what stuff you can do. If you get an error, try fixing it. If you're still stuck, just Google it. Trust me, the answer's right there. And you just have to find the right website. And yeah, let's just go on to the text editor, and then I'll show you guys how you can write down a bit of code to give you a bit more of a practical understanding of this topic. Okay, so we're here onto my text editor. In this example, I'm going to be using Vim. You don't have to use Vim. If you want to use Sublime Text, which I showed you guys in the last video, you can use that, or use whatever text editor you're comfortable with. But I just prefer using Vim. So I opened the file so I opened up the program which we wrote in the last video, which simply prints out hello world. So if I run this right now, you'll see it prints out hello world. Let's make this a bit bigger so you guys can see it properly. Let's do 24. Okay, so as you can see, it prints out hello world right there. Ignore all the stuff on top and at the bottom. So it says hello world, and we can actually do the same thing with a lot of other stuff. So first off, let's break this down a bit. So print, if you guys do not know, so print right here, it's a function because it's got all these parentheses at the end of the start. Now, here we got hello world, which is a string because it's in single quotes. We can also do the same thing in double quotes. So if I do print, then we could do double quotes as well. Hello world. That's an exclamation mark there. Okay, if we run this now, we're still going to get hello world with the exclamation mark there. And if you do the single quotes, as you can see, let's do that. Hello world. Oops, here we go. Okay. We still get hello world. You can add a quotation mark if you guys want that. Yeah, see? So we still get the same output. So this right here is what we call strings. Now strings, as I said, is just a line of code, so it's basically anything inside of single quotations or double quotations. It doesn't really matter. And we can also do similar things with something like we can also do the same thing with all the other data types. So just quickly write down a comment right here saying strings. Okay, now this right here where we put a hashtag, I think it's called a pound sign in some other areas. Okay, let's call it a pound sign. So I put a pound sign here. If you see when I run the program, I don't get any errors. Now this is something else called a comment, and this is basically whatever we put after this pound sign, it's just going to ignore it. This is just human text for us to understand what's happening inside of the program. So if I did something like type a bunch of random text here, then I run the program, I get an error. It says this name error, this is not defined, blah blah blah. If I put this as if I comment this out, then as you can see we don't get an error because Python is just going to ignore the comment. It's just going to think that it's for us to read and not for it to actually actually for it to run. Now let's go on to talking about integers. And by the way, as I talk about abbreviations, this is called a string. So str, its abbreviation is string's abbreviation str. So let's just say I can do something like print str, and as you can see my syntax highlighter, so my color scheme automatically highlighted it because it knows that this is going to be a string. And hello world, let's run this. We get hello world again right here. Okay, let me just quickly close that. Why is this thing not doing it? Okay, that's a bit strange. Okay, now it works. Okay, so str is basically telling Python that this is a string. We don't actually have to do this in Python, as I said before, because this is a dynamically typed language, and whether or not we actually define that it's a string or not, it doesn't really care because it's going to, whenever we run the program at runtime, it's going to check through and assign all the values. So we don't actually have to do that. But we can if we want to. It just slows us down. On statically typed languages like C++ or C or C#, we actually have to define that this is an integer or a string, whatever it is, or else it won't run. Okay, we can also print out integers, which are basically whole numbers. And we can print out whatever it is as long as it's a whole number. So let's just say we want to print out some random number like this, a really big number. We can do that. Okay, we printed it right here. Okay, I think I'll probably do something like this. So if you do print and then we just do this right here, which says with an empty string, is just going to make a new line, which makes things a bit easier for you guys to read. So I just printed out that number that we wrote before there. So we can also do the same thing here, but instead of right here we put str. But instead of having to do it like that, we can also we have to use another abbreviation, which is going to be int. And int basically means integer. So let's just say I copy this line here. I can go forward a bit, then I'll do int, and then I'll just go to the end of this line, and then we will finish out the parentheses. Make sure that you finish out the parentheses or else you get a syntax error. If we run this, we still get that. because Python knows that it is an integer. We don't have to do this, as I said, but it's optional if you guys want to. Actually, I'm gonna go up here and then I'm going to write down here str. So if you guys, I'll just write this down to make things easier for you guys to understand it. Okay. Now we can also do the same thing with float values. Float values are decimal values, so we can, instead of doing int or that, we have to use this word here saying float. So we can do print true, and then we can also do print false. And I'm also going to add an empty line right here to make things a bit neater whenever we run the file. So we could do print true or false. And then we can also do the same thing here, but instead of doing that, we're going to have to do print bool, and as you can see, it automatically highlighted it for us, true. Now, what output do you think we're going to get this whenever you get it from running this program? We're going to get true, false, and true. Now, if you see here, we wrote down print true, print false, and then boolean true. They're all the same thing. But you want to make sure that we know that this is a string. Sorry, this is a boolean, because you might confuse this with hello world right here, which is a string. This is going to talk about another built-in function, which is called type. Now, I think that the best way to understand this is going to be, I believe that Python has a built-in feature that allows you to see documentation on the fly. Let's try that. Python type. Okay, it looks like if you guys want to know a bit, as you know, I think let's go to official Python 3 docs. This is the Python documentation. So let's see built-in types. Let's search up for type. Okay, here we go. Type objects. So type objects represent blah blah blah, and objects type can be accessed by the built-in function. So remember this keyword I was talking about, type. Let's see the example right here. So you know, that's going to object-oriented programming. I don't want to do that. So as you can see, it says class type. Ignore this part, and it says object. It basically means put the data type that you want to use here. So I'll show you guys how you can do that. Let's go down a bit here, and then I'll show you guys if we can do this. So let's just say we have a string right here, which is hello. Now we know this is a string, but if we printed out something else, actually not, let's not use that, it's a bad example. Let's do true. Now right now this is a string, but if we printed out something like so if we printed out true here, actually no, I'll just do print out true. So if you run this program here, we still get true, and they both look the same, but one of them, as we can see here, is a boolean value and one of them is a string. Now how can we figure that out? Now type will tell us whether or not this is going to be a string or if it's going to be a boolean. And let's just run this. So I'll add a empty line here, and I'll just do that. Let's just make this a bit neater. Okay, it didn't show us anything in the console, and that's because we didn't use print. Okay, now let's do that. If you run it now, okay, we get class str and class bool. So as you can see up here, if I go up here in the code, okay. Why is this thing not letting me do that? Oh, okay, it's still running. I guess we have to close it. What? Okay, here we go. So it says str, and then it said bool, which wait, what? That's a bit strange. Oh, it appears I might have got a bit off topic and talked about integers. Sorry, I talked about booleans straight away. Oh, so as I talked about, it's coming bool, which is the shortcut. So if we run this again, it says class str and class bool. So it tells that. So ignore the class part, but as you can see, it says str here, it says bool here. So Python knows there's a difference between them. I'll show you guys how you can do float values because it looks like I forgot to do that. So 9.9 is an example of a decimal, and if we run this, we're going to get 9.9 right here. And we can also verify. Actually, before I show that, I can show you guys we can do float, and then let's do 9.9, and then we're gonna get the same output if you run it here. And then we can also do print type, and then we'll just do 9.9. And as you can see, Python knows that it's a float value. And that really is just all the data types that we have in Python. And I also talked to you guys about print and how you can use that. And I talked to you guys about type, which is an extra thing. We also discussed about dynamically typed versus statically typed languages. So I think we covered a lot in this video, and if you guys have any questions, leave in the comments below, and I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible. So I hope to enjoy this video, and I will I'll upload the next video very soon, which will be covering about variables and how we can use those as well. Okay, so that's it for me today. Bye.